ngabe iBhayibheli singalithemba yini? Is it a trustworthy book? Some people say ukuthi incwadi ebhalwe abelungu to control abantu abamnyama, bathi abelungu bafike basinika iBhayibheli bathatha umhlaba. Abanye bathi iBhayibheli ngeke uze ulikholwe livuna wonke umuntu. Abanye bathi kunezinto ezingama suggestions ezingawona ama commands, but we believe iBhayibheli because lizwi likaNkulunkulu. We believe iBhayibheli because we have spent time to research and find out how it got to be what it is. We are not some ignorant people abangafuni ukwazi ukuthi iBhayibheli lifike kanjani, solikholwa nje linjengoba linjalo. But the main reason why we believe izwi likaNkulunkulu, it's because uNkulunkulu's promise ukuthi uzoligcina li pure. And so unless we want to believe ukuthi uNkulunkulu has failed, we will say ukuthi izwi likaNkulunkulu selingcolisekile, it is not trustworthy anymore. There are many alterations that have been made. We cannot believe in it. We cannot put our trust in it. But if we believe uJesu lokakusho mayithi the law and the prophets will not pass away, my words will not pass away, then we have to believe ukuthi uNkulunkulu really did keep that promise. Ngibingelele kwindlu igcwele egameni lenkosi uJesu Kristu. Amen. Well, topic esinikezwe yona ke it's a very exciting topic. It's an apologetic topic. Okusho ukuthi ke i-topic lena ovamise ukuyithola mawukuthi ukhuluma nabantu and uzama ukuba explainer noma ubachazele ngeBhayibheli noma ubachazele ngoNkulunkulu. They will always ask about the Bible. They have ama views about the Bible. So umbuzo sibhekene nawo phambi kwethu namhlanje ukuthi ngabe iBhayibheli singalithemba yini? Is it a trustworthy book? And I like the fact ukuthi ke ngihlangene nama students namhlanje. So I want us ukuthi sike sigqoke amakepisi okucabanga, ama academic caps, and think about the question ephambi kwethu. So there are many views abantu abanawo with regards to iBhayibheli. Some people say ukuthi incwadi ebhalwe abelungu to control abantu abamnyama, bathi abelungu bafike basinika iBhayibheli bathatha umhlaba. So that's a view abantu abanawo ngeBhayibheli, incwadi ebhalwe abelungu control abantu abamnyama. Abanye bathi iBhayibheli ngeke uze ulikholwe livuna wonke umuntu. Abanye bathi kunezinto ezingama suggestions ezingawona ama commands. Abanye bathi liphikisana ne-science, abanye bathi liphikisana ne-history, abanye bathi kunezincwadi ezakhishwa ngoba abelungu babekade bengahambisani nazo. And this is the most common one, but abantu iBhayibheli is polluted, lingcolisekile, so asikwazi ukulikholwa ngenxa ukuthi abantu balokho be-edit izinto over the years. Abantu bayalithatha bayali-edit, ba-edit izinto bazathi ingakho kunama editions amangaka, o New King James, o King James, o ESV, o NIV. So bathi ngenxa lo ama versions amaningi kushuthi noma ubani nje lokho efika azolishintsha a-add okunye asusa okunye. So bathi lingcolisekile, it cannot be trusted. This is a common view kwibandla elibizwa ngokuthi i-Church of the Latter-day Saints, commonly known as ama-Mormons. I'm not sure if we've come into contact with them. Abaningi kakhulu ke la eSouth Africa bandise kakhulu eAmerica since kuyila baqala khona. So nabo bakholwa yilokho, which is the reason why begcina babhala incwadi yabo. uJoseph Smith athi wahamba waya entabeni wafike wambulela ukuthi akayibhale. So those are the problems abantu abanazo. Zonke lezi zinto abacabanga ukuthi lizona abantu iBhayibheli is not true. Ama opinions abantu abanawo abangeke bakwazi ukwa substantiate. But I want us ukuthi namhlanje sike sikhulume and just put on ama thinking caps ethu and talk about iBhayibheli as incwadi, as a book. We'll talk about the Bible as a book. Can iBhayibheli silithembe as a book that is preserved? Masikhuluma ngencwadi preserved sisho ukuthi singayithatha yini njengencwadi esayiyo lento ekade yiye kwasekuqaleni. Is it preserved in a sense ukuthi lokho okuthiwa kwabhalwa uMoses kusayikho yini lokho esinako phambi kwethu? lokho okwabhalwa uJoshua kusayikho lini lokho ekuphambi kwethu, lokho kwabhalwa abaprofeti yikho lokho esinako phambi kwethu kuyo yonke leminyaka kwabhalwa kuyo, because we know Old Testament was written way before uJesu Kristu. So njengoba siku-2021 njengamanje, it's in the year of our Lord Jesus Christ 2021, which means ukuthi siqala ukubala unyakeni wokuzalwa kukaJesu sasaqhubeka sesifika ku-2021. So umbuzo ekufanele ukuthi siwuphendule ukuthi since iOld Testament indala ngisho kunoJesu uqobo lwakhe, is lezi incwadi esinazo ezisuka kwiOld Testament, even nalezi ku-New Testament, because zona sezilaste ku-2000 years, are they still reliable? Singakwazi ukuthi siyithembe, singakwazi ukuthi lokho sikufundayo sathi yiloko kwabhalwa umpostoli Paul ngempela, lokho kwabhalwa uPetro impela. So that's the question that we are going to be talking about. Is the word of God, is the Bible still pure? So let's read Matthew 5 verse number 17. Jesus here is talking about the prophets and the law. Prophets and the law, it's the Old Testament. So Jesus about the Old Testament will either call it the law, he'll call it law and the prophets. But those in the kwingqondo yabantu ababekade bemuzwa bemlalele babazi ukukhuluma ngeOld Testament. So he's talking about this lapha ku Matthew chapter number 5 verse number 17. Uthi, don't think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. If selithandwa abantu ke leli laziwa nayidakwa leli verse, uJesu wathi akazi uzochitha uzogcwalisa. So uJesu wayekhuluma ngani lapho uthi, don't think ukuthi ngizile ukuzochitha umthetho nabaprofeti. That's the Old Testament. I did not come to abolish but to fulfill. And then verse 18, for truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or one stroke of the 18. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not a smallest letter or one stroke of a letter will pass away from the law until all things are accomplished. Uthi akhongisho inhlamvana encane eyophasa away noma eyolahlwa kuze konke kugcwaliseke. So uJesu Kristu uthini lapha, he is telling us ukuthi i-Old Testament will be preserved. uNkulunkulu will preserve the Old Testament until yonke into ebhaliwe ku-Old Testament is fulfilled, which means ukuthi until the end of times. So uJesu was promising there ukuthi even noma ngathiwa kuphela 3000 years after yena ekwakhulumile namazwi, if everything that is written in the law and the prophets, which means the Old Testament, is not fulfilled, none of the letters, even a stroke of a letter will pass away. So he's promising that the Old Testament will be preserved. We see also the same language Luke when Jesus is talking about isicebi no Lazarus. Isicebi ngathi sicela ukuthi siphinisele emhlabeni ukuze siyowonisha abafowabo. uJesu uthi ukhona uMoses nabaprophets. So he's saying the Old Testament is there ukuthi libalide into truth. Matthew chapter 24 verse number 17, not only is uJesu saying ukuthi Old Testament will be preserved njengoba sikubona ku verse number chapter 5 verse number 18, but he also speaks about amazwi awakhulume yena uqobo lwakhe. If we go to Matthew 24, there is talking about end times. Ukuthi kokwenzakalani ekugcineni kwekhathi. Verse number 17, uJesu laphana is talking about his words. Uthi amazwi akhe, none of them will ever pass away. There is none of the words that uJesu Kristu has spoken that will ever pass away. So even nalapho he is promising ukuthi amazwi awakhulumile yena will not pass away. 24 verse 35 wakhona, it reads like this. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. So not only does he promise ukuthi the Old Testament will not pass away, the law and the prophets, angizile ukuzobachitha the law and the prophets, but I've come ukuthi ngizowafulfill, and none of the letters akhona emthethweni will pass away or in the Old Testament. Matthew 24 verse 35, he's now saying ukuthi even amazwi awakhuluma yena, heaven and earth will pass away, but none of the words awakhuluma yena uJesu Kristu will pass away. Right? So there is that promise that Jesus is making there. He's making a promise that the Old Testament will be preserved, and he's making a promise that amazwi akhe will be preserved. And that can literally translate to say it's the Gospels. The Gospels, because I record that amazwi awakhulumile uJesu Kristu, he's saying the Gospels will be preserved. Not only the Gospels will be preserved, but even ama epistles, because uPaul mayibhala kubaseCorinth, when he gets to chapter number 14 towards the end, after he has given wonke ama instructions uthi umuntu ongakholwa lamazwi engiwakhulumayo kufuneka azi ukuthi umuntu uma ukuthi uyiconsider ukuthi umprofeti noma umuntu spiritual, he must recognize into engiyibhalayo ziqhamuka enkosini. So even nama epistles qobo lwawo nawo aqhamuka enkosini, so even now will be preserved. uJesu Kristu is promising that ku Matthew 24 verse 35. Now with that in mind sengifuna ukuthi ke let's put our thinking caps on. We have ama promises aqhamuka kuJesu Kristu ukuthi Old Testament will be preserved. We have amazwi aqhamuka kuJesu Kristu ukuthi New Testament will also be preserved. Let's look at how history is preserved, how history is recorded. Simple. I'll make an example about Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great is a man who lived, I think he was born, if you look at history, around 300 BC, which means 300 years, more than 300 years before Jesus Christ even walked the earth. Alexander the Great conquered many places, and we have umlando wakhe written down. But let me shock you with something. Umlando ka Alexander the Great was recorded by a person who was Quintus Cassius Rufus. This person recorded history ka Alexander the Great in the 1st century. His 1st century means which it was the first 100 years of post ukuphila ka Jesu Christ. Which means it's somewhere around 180. There is about 400 years after Alexander the Great had lived. So the person who wayibhala ebuka retrospectively. So most of the things ayekade eyibhala were stories that were being told, translated down using the oral tradition abantu bexoxa ngo-Alexander the Great. And then ubhala lezo zinto ethatha evidence from abantu abazwe kwabanye abantu and writing lezo zinto about Alexander the Great. And do you know ukuthi the latest or the earliest manuscript aziwayo abhalwe wuye uQuintus Cassius Rufus lona our 9th century, which means ukuthi when people were reading their history leyo and translating beyibhala phansi just to have amanye ama copies ayo wonke awabhala yena, they don't even have the original one eyabhalwa wuye nge-1st century. The one that is surviving the earliest ekhona in 9th century, which means it was 900 AD, unyaka 900 AD, which is 800 years after ibhaliwe, umuntu wayebhale 400 years after seyenzekile. So they don't have a lot of manuscripts to even confirm ukuthi lezi zinto ezikwi-manuscript yango 9th century iyafana exactly nale yange-1st century. So we have your history ka Alexander the Great coming from abantu abebekade beyixoxa, ibhalwa umuntu owayengekho 400 years later. And you know ukuthi kwenzakalana abantu mabexoxa indaba, they add deep eyes, and uyakwazi nawe lokho because uke wamxoxela umuntu indaba before ukuthi uma usuyixoxa futhi uphonse nosawotshana ngaphezulu khona izoba mnanjana. Yabo. So by the time ifika kumuntu oyilalela indaba 400 years later ingazange izirecord umuntu owayibona yena ekhona lapho kuleyo ndawo leyo, ifika ingasekho very reliable. But have you ever heard anyone ephikisa history ka Alexander the Great? I've not met anyone othi no lento ebhalwe ngo-Alexander the Great ayikho. They believe le history yabhalwa umuntu owayibhala 400 years later, nama manuscripts akhalahleka latest esinayo ya 900 years after wayekade ibhalile yena, which means ukuthi ayisitranslatiwe 900 years later. So I find ukuthi abantu abaphikisa ilona iBhayibheli ukuthi li trustworthy are not consistent people. Because uma ungasubabuza ukuthi bazi kanjani ukuthi uShaka Zulu wake waphila, babengekho uShaka Zulu ephila. Umlando waShaka Zulu wabhalwa abelungu because ayekho umuntu omnyama oyekwazi ukubhala nokurecord. So the only things esizaziyo zabhalwa ama-British, now ebhala from a perspective of being British. But siyayikholwa izinto esizwa ngabo, even though zabhalwa abantu ababekade babelungu. What if baqamba amanga? What if uShaka was not the greatest leader that ever existed? What if lezi zinto abathi wazenza akazenzanga? We don't know. So sinezinto esizwe ngabantu coming from i-oral tradition, ogogo bexoxela iy'ngane zabo ukuthi uShaka kwakhona inkosi yakuthiwa uShaka, nogogo labo bexoxela iy'ngane zabo nabanye bexoxela iy'ngane zabo. So we get that from labo bantu laba beyixoxa zindaba until today. Namanje kusaney'ndaba esizaziyo ngoShaka kuthiwa wayibulala abantu abafishane and zonke lezo zinto lezo. Naloko kwakade kubhalwe ulo mlungu oyedwa ekade erekhoda leyo history leyo. There are not so many people who wrote about uShaka Zulu because babengekho abantu abaningi ababekade bebhala ngayo. But you ever get anyone othi uShaka Zulu akaza exist because wayengambonanga? No. People believe uShaka Zulu exist from that one source eyabhalwa umlungu, eyibhala from a perspective of being umlungu, and from leyo tradition yabantu belokho bexoxa beze indaba seyifika kithina njengamanje. But uJesu Kristu ke yena i different yakhe. uJesu history yakhe ibhalwe a few years after esenyukile waya ezulwini. Waphila for 33 years, waya esiphambanweni, wangcwatshwa, wavuka, wakhuphukela ezulwini. And abafundi bakhe emva ukuthi sebamkelise umoya engcwele ngePentecost, that is when izinto akade ekhulumela uJesu zaqala ukubuya kubona, sebeqala ukunderstand a whole fully ukuthi uJesu Kristu bezeleni emhlabeni, and they were writing history ukuthi kwenzakaleni. So you get Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, all of them recording izinto ezenzakalile as early as uJesu esasanda ukukhuphukela ezulwini. So there you don't have a history ebhalwe abantu abebengekho njengoba uAlexander waba nehistory ebhalwe umuntu wabhala 400 years later. You have ama eyewitnesses, abantu ababekhona abayibonela ngawabo uJesu ephila emhlabeni. And you have them writing not later but soon. And this is what it means. If someone writes anything soon, it's different from isikhathi sikaShaka. Isikhathi sikaShaka we didn't have a lot of people ababe literate, which means ukuthi umlungu lo wabhala abantu abekwazi ukum-understand, abakwazi ukufunda into abayibhalile bayiverify ukuthi iqiniso yini, kwakwabanye abelungu. And because babengekho abantu ababefundile, abantu abamnyama, akekho umuntu owayengayifunda athi hayi lento ebhalwe umlungu ayikho. So by the time abantu abamnyama get to be able to be literate and read, already abantu ababekade berekhode leya history kaShaka basebengasekho. And so sekunzima ukuthi uverify, usunogogo nje kuphela abasho ukuthi hayi yena wayengayenza into kanjalo. But here esikhathini sikaJesu you have people who wrote within a generation, which means kukhona abantu abesaphila ngaleso sikhathi. uMatthew mayibhala ukuthi uJesu wenza ukuthi uJohn mayibhala ukuthi emshadweni wasekhana uJesu waphendula iwayini waphenduka amanzi wawenza iwayini. There were people ababekhona ngaleso sikhathi who were there emshadweni wasekhana who could say ukuthi hey ayikaze yenzeke into enjalo. We don't have any document yabantu ababephikisa izinto ezayibhalwa abantu ababe ama eyewitnesses akhona. No Matthew incwadi zabo they did not hide them until kwadlula igeneration alabantu ababekhona. Lezi incwadi lezana zazikhona ngesikhathi abantu babekade bekhona uJesu ephila bekhona nabo. Akekho umuntu noyedwa waphikisa wathi lento ebhaliwe is not true, right? So we have that. 2, we have ama stories correspondayo aqhamuka from ama sources ahlukene. We have uMatthew, uMark, uLuke, uJohn, all of them writing from different perspectives. Bebhala into correspondayo bonke, but writing from different perspectives. So masihlanganisa siyabona ukuthi there is a picture here that is being drawn and yavumelana yonke lento. It's like mawukuthi abantu abawu5 baxoxa indaba bonke bengekho erumini eyodwa bayixoxela umuntu. And that is what happened. When Mark was writing, he was not writing in the presence of Luke, he was not writing in the presence of Matthew. All these people were writing independently. And if you take ama letters abo nama gospels abo wa compare, you can see ukuthi asimila kanjani, which means ukuthi it's impossible ukuthi bonke they would lie. That would be a greater miracle than ukuthi bahlale endlini bayicombine lento yagcina iphuma ilento eyiyona. Secondly, omunye mhlamba ngaobject athi sazi ngani mhlambe ngempela bahlala phansi ba device ngempela lento bayibhala benza sure ukuthi ya correspond. Again, I'd say ukuthi that would be more of a miracle than ukuthi bayibhale be separate, because Even lento abayisebenzisayo ukwenza textual criticism, when they look at the evidence, it's what they use even in the courtroom. Mawuthi khona kunina owenza law uzokwazi ukuthi when you call ama witnesses abone something and they all tell the story in a similar way, word for word, then you already know ukuthi that is a lie. Into ehlanganisiwe le wafika washo umuntu ufika uthi you shouldn't have ama witnesses telling a story ngendlela efanayo ncamashi, because they are not going to be seeing it from a perspective efanayo. So you have ama gospels, all of them, when you put them together uyakwazi ukubona istory ukuthi istory siya correspond even though singaxoxwanga ngendlela efanayo. So that means ukuthi labantu ababekade besixoxa babengekho erumini eyodwa, because you would see ama similarities are so clear ukuthi lo muntu ubhala from a perspective efana nale yalomunye okusho ukuthi babe ndawonye. So you have that as well as evidence ukuthi when they wrote ama gospels, they were not writing ama fables, they were writing into abayibonile. Right? So umbuzo ukuthi ke how did they survive the manuscripts? How did they survive? And I think that is what we're going to talk about, what are reliable kanjani. But I just want to put this forth. Ibhayibheli is the most reliable book on earth. Ayikho neyodwa incwadi reliable ukudlula iBhayibheli. So how did it get preserved? How did it get preserved? Remember example engiyenzile. Ngenze example ngo Alexander the Great, nokuthi umuntu wabhala 400 years and manuscript yayiqhamuka kuyena kuphela earliest esinayo 900 years later. In New Testament has not 2 manuscripts, not 3 manuscripts, not 100 manuscripts, not 500 manuscripts. There is 10,000 manuscripts abizwa ngokuthi Latin Vulgate. There is 8,000 abizwa ngokuthi umwahlanganisi Ethiopic, Slavic ne-Armenian, and there is the Codex Sinaiticus ne-Codex Vaticanicus. Over 2,000 ama manuscripts are lapho. Umwahlanganisa lawo manuscripts, they add up to about 20,000 manuscripts. Isho ukuthini then? Isho ukuthi mangase kuthiwa you get iphepha elikanje elino Matthew, you have 20,000 papers akanje ano Matthew in different places over a different period of time, which means ukuthi mangase kuthiwe uthola this one manuscript and ufuna ukuthi uyoyicomparisha to see ukuthi lo muntu okunika le manuscripts, okunika leli phepha leli ubhala into eyiyona yena eyiqiniso, you can take la amanye awo 20,000 wonke uwabeke eceleni kanje and read from line to line ukuthi uJesu wayese ethatha isinkwa, ubhekelandela wathatha isinkwa. Okay, shuthi kuyiqiniso le line lona u-consistent kuwo wonke lama manuscripts awo 20, which means ukuthi lokho akubhalile lo muntu akuyona into ayisuse engqondweni yakhe. It was translated kanjena over a period of time. Again, this means ukuthi if you find a manuscript, because ima manuscripts ayisebenza kanje, when let's say Paul wrote a letter to the Corinthians, the letter would first go to ibandla laseCorinth, and ibandla laseCorinth would read that letter. Emva uselifunde ibandla laseCorinth so that izoba necopy yalo, they would find someone to go and write word for word lo kade kubhaliwe incwadi original ebiqhamuka from uPaul, so that izodlula le bandleni elinye mhlambe le Efeso, because ngase Efeso badinga ukuzwa lento ayibhalile uPaul, iyahamba le original letter iye Efeso. Ibandla laseCorinth seliselevel eline copy manje because someone translated word for word what is written. Mayifika originally ifika eEfeso, they do the same thing, badlulise eColos, so eColos yeSmyrna, so eSmyrna yekwelinye ibandla. So wonke lamabandla lawo they keep writing ama copies up, which means if for example umuntu waseCorinthe missed ulayini mhlambe uma ukuthi ukubona ufunde uma uthi wafunda ngezikhathi zethu thina sasibhala ebhodini, so you would write ama notes and look up, ubhala line look up. Sometimes you would miss a line, thothi mhlambe uline bothi ubiqala ngo there, so ucabanga bese ngubhalele lo line kanti uyaweqa usuye ku line wesithathu. So uthola umuntu waseCorinthe missed a line waweqa umunye owaseSmayina akaweqanga yena nowase Efes nowase Philip nowakuphi abaweqanga bona lo line lo. So when you compare ama manuscripts awu 20,000 you'll see ukuthi lo line weqiwe ku manuscript eyodwa kuphela, which means ukuthi most likely lawa amanye abenawo wonke originally binawo. So you would know ukuthi original yayibukeka kanjani. You have more reliable data to actually compare ukuthi yini eyiqiniso nengayona iqiniso. Uthothi mhlawumbe umunye kuphindile ulayini, uthothi mhlawumbe ithe imifika eColos for example, ulayini othile wawuphinda kabili umuntu, because kwakwenzeka nalokho nawe uyakwazi ukuthi ubhale ebhodini, wakubhala ulayini ukuthi ubheke ebhodini kanti usubhala ulayini ofanayo, ubone usufunda ama notes ongawuphinda lo layini lona. So uma uzocomparisha ama notes abo bonke abantu, you'll know ukuthi okay wawungaphindwanga lo line lo, imini engenza iphutha. So when you compare wonke lawo manuscripts and you want to have incwadi eyiBhayibheli njengaleli iBhayibheli esesinalo namhlanje, you are able to do that. You are able to have the most accurate reading ye original le ekade iyona. So we have about 20,000 manuscripts of the New Testament that are surviving even today. If you compare that to any history, again use the example ka Alexander the Great, use the example ka Shaka Zulu. There is no book in the whole world enama manuscripts amangaka onoma ubani mangase kuthiwa ufuna ukuprove ukuthi lento eyibhalwe khona ziyiqiniso angakwazi ukwenza lokho ngokuthi alone check wonke lawo manuscripts. So yeah, we can say ukuthi sina reliable sources to have what we have today. When we talk about the New Testament, we are talking about incwadi people spent time ngempela comparing lawo ma 20,000 manuscripts to come up with what we have today, right? So in Old Testament yona singayithemba kanjani. That's the New Testament. We're gonna get to the point la sikhuluma khona ngecanon ukuthi lezi incwadi esinazo ifike kanjani ukuthi zibe seBhayibhelini. The Old Testament yona yakhiwe a lot of books there, but the first 5 is known as Pentateuch, and it's Pentateuch inalezi incwadi ezo5 ezabhalwa uMoses. It's Exodus, Genesis, Leviticus, Numbers, no Deuteronomy, and incwadi zomthetho lezo. So Jesu mayekhuluma ngomthetho usuke ekhuluma ngalezo incwadi lezo bese athi naba-prophetic, it's the minor, the major prophets, and there's other books there as well. There are my historical books. But lezi incwadi ezo5 we notice ibhalwe uMoses because Exodus chapter number 17 uyasitshela ukuthi ubani umuntu oyibhalile lezi incwadi. I'll just read Exodus chapter number 17, chapter 17 verse number 14, just to give us an idea of what it says to us. Verse 14 it reads like this: The Lord then said to Moses, write this down on a scroll as a reminder and recite it to Joshua. I will completely blot out the memory of Amalek under heaven. So uNkulunkulu here is giving instruction ukuthi akabhale this thing. This was a specific instruction that I bad. What I recited to Josh, and wasomtshela ukuthi uzokwenzani uNkulunkulu. And we see ukuthi lezi zinto lezo Moses that he was writing down, it comes down from the mountain, he writes umthetho yishumi, and we have them here written down for us. They were preserved. So lezi incwadi ezo5 zika Moses uNkulunkulu ekade emnikeza zona, and Moses then passed them down wayinikeza uJoshua. So if we read to incwadi kaJoshua, it's just after Pentateuch. Joshua chapter number 8 verse number 32. So it reads like this: There on the stones Joshua copied the law of Moses, which he had written in the presence of the Israelites. All Israel, residents, alien and citizens alike, with their elders, officers and judges, stood on either side of the Ark of the Lord's Covenant, facing the Levitical priests who carried it. Half of them were in front of Mount Gerizim, and half of them were in Mount Ebal, as Moses, the Lord's servant, had commanded earlier concerning blessing the people of Israel. Right, so we do see that happening there. Verse 34, after Joshua read aloud all the words. So after Joshua had written down verbatim into ekade ishiwo uMoses, umthetho wonke kaMoses. Emva kwalokho he read it out aloud, the words of the law, the blessing as well as the curses, according to all that is written in the book of the law. So Moses passed these books down to Joshua. So they were kept, they were preserved. Not only did Joshua want to read them, because he had them, he could have just read them aloud, but he translated them down. So it means these people were spending time translating, even now wanting to have different manuscripts, and we recite and get to know it by head. So not only was it written down and read to them, but it was kept by scribes and the oral tradition. If you read the New Testament, uthola khona about ababhali nabaFarisi. So ababhali were literally people who were occupation yabo ukuthi bahlale phansi and translate the law. Umsebenzi wabo law, they were sitting down translating, or not translating, sorry, they were transcribing the law. Bathathe the Pentateuch le abanayo, bathathe the prophets and all these things bayibhale phansi and make sure ukuthi nama scrolls are available for ama synagogues, because ama synagogues were different. So kwakuba nzima ukuthi mhlambe khona ikhophi eyodwa ya Isaiah ibe khona let's say kwi synagogue elilodwa elise Jerusalem, kuzibe khona ezinye indawo futhi einama synagogue ezidingayo. So ama scribes umsebenzi wawo ukuthi bayibhale phansi lento le, bayibhale kuma scrolls, and they would make sure ukuthi if each and every synagogue has it. Not only ukuthi each and every synagogue has it, but ama families are rich in the Israel nation would also pay ama scribes ukuthi ababhalele phansi, so that they will have these books in their homes. So you have ama manuscripts as well preserved in that sense. So when you hear about the Dead Sea Scrolls, kwatholakala ama scrolls akade ese Dead Sea, and people were hoping, ama atheists were hoping ukuthi finally kuzotholakala incwadi ezoprove ukuthi iBhayibheli alikho. But ama scrolls atholakala eDead Sea were confirming what we already have. They were confirming incwadi ekhona ku-Old Testament, and they were written lezi zinto esinazo already kwi-Old Testament, except some few differences there and there. But again, if you do ama manuscripts, you compare them, you can see ukuthi originally ekade kanjani. So ama families now, we don't know what ama Dead Sea Scrolls ended up kanjani as a Dead Sea. It's possible ukuthi mhlambe there were people who heard ukuthi someone was coming to attack isithi ababekuyo, so they took, because they treasured lezi zinto zayibiza, kwakubiza ukuthi uthole iscribe translate noma sekulona transcribe and pay the scribe ukuthi uyigcine lezo zinto. So when someone comes and burns things in your town, and that was the problem abenayo ngaleso sikhathi, people wanted to invade and take over indawo. Possible ukuthi either that synagogue or that family ekade naloma scribes ekade naloma scrolls yawathatha yawafihla somewhere la ekade ngekaza atholwe khona yilabo bantu noma bawashise khona, and so atholakala later on preserved kanjalo. So we have that as well. Not only is ama scribes were keeping these things intact, but the oral tradition as well. The Israelites have a tradition of reciting izinto so that bengeke baze bayikhohlwe. Ama Israelites were people who were concerned with making ingane zabo ukuthi ifunde zazi. So they would recite izinto, especially manginomkhosi othile, manginomkhosi wamadokodo, mhlawumbe umkhosi wephasika. They would sit down as a family, and the youngest of them would recite izinto ezenzeka eGibhithe ukuthi uNkulunkulu wathumela amalona ama plagues, amaxoxo, ifamine, ama firstborn. They would recite lezo zinto lezo every year. So as bekhula nabo beba nezingane, the firstborn would have that task yokwenza lokho makukhona leyo mili eyenziwayo makulona makumkhosi wephasika. So they had a great oral tradition. Not only ukuthi they had these things written down, but they also knew them. So they would confirm lezo zinto ukuthi bahamba bayifunda. And that was a tradition eyayikhona throughout the time. So those are two things. It's the scribes who were keeping the books written and translating them, and the families. So which means you could also compare and see what the original looked like. Two, you have the oral tradition. 3, you had the confirmation by uJesu Kristu uqobo lwakhe. uJesu Kristu, when he speaks, he was confirming lezi zincwadi lezi ukuthi ngempela ziyizwi likaNkulunkulu. You read from John chapter number 5, verse 46 to verse number 57. uJesu there is speaking about the Old Testament. Let me just read a few verses from there. John 5. Verse 46. Right, verse 46. Not that anyone has seen the Father except the one who is from God. He has seen the Father. Truly I tell you, anyone who believes has eternal life. I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate manna in the wilderness and they died. You see, already there he's quoting from incwadi ya-Exodus ukuthi badli imana ehlane and bafa. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that anyone who eats of it will not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Everyone eats of this bread will live forever. The bread that I will give for eternal life is my flesh. So uJesu there was confirming Exodus ukuthi lento ebhaliwe Exodus is the word of God, noma is true. Romans chapter number 10 verse number 5, we see umpostoli Paul also naye confirming some of the things from the Old Testament. Let's read 10 verse 5. And we see a lot of quotations done, especially if you read incwadi yamaHebheru, but I'm not going to read all of them. I'll just take these few. 10 verse number 5 corner reads like this. Since Moses writes about the righteousness that is from the law, the one who does these things will live by them. So again, he's quoting from Moses, is saying ukuthi lokho okwabhalwa uMoses kuvela kuNkulunkulu, and those words are taken from Leviticus chapter 18 verse number 5. We also have the apostles, not only Paul, but other apostles also quoting from some of the books from the Old Testament, and I'll just quote one from Acts chapter number 3. And that's the sermon ga Peter, verse number 22 corner. He says, Moses said, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your brothers and sisters. You must listen to everything he tells you. So even Apostle Peter naye, he quotes from the Old Testament, confirming what is written there is reliable. So oral tradition, the scribes, Jesus, the apostles, they are all confirming the Old Testament is trustworthy. But then we have in the preserved collection, and that's what we have today with Old Testament yet from Genesis to Malachi. From Genesis to Malachi, what we have is what is called the Septuagint. A Septuagint was a translation is Greek from his Hebrew. So zonke lezi incwadi uMoses ayibhala kuPentateuch or Exodus or Leviticus, zonke abaprophets bonke ababhala, the minor and the major prophets, they all wrote in the Hebrew language because Jews were Hebrews. They are Hebrew people. So when people started to invade Romans and people started to speak more Greek, there was a need to translate a Hebrew text ibe Greek. So that's what we have when we speak about Septuagint. It's the Greek translation of Tanakh. Tanakh was the Hebrew original that they had as a collection of these books. So you find some differences when you look at these two things. Tanakh has less books than Septuagint, but that doesn't mean ukuthi Septuagint khona izinto abayi-add. With Tanakh, for example, the minor prophets are all combined to be one book. So you find wonke minor prophets or Joel, you name them, all are just collected to be one book. And Ruth is taken as, I think, the end ga Judges. So Ruth is added as part of Judges, as the ending of Judges. Lamentation is added as the ending ga Jeremiah. So that's the reason why Tanakh seems to have less books than a Septuagint. But what we do have, Tina, is a Septuagint, because they broke down lezo zinto bathatha uLamentation bawenza wodwa waseceleni, ama-minor prophets bawahlukanisa ukuthi abe yincwadi ngokwazo. So those collections are also were kept intact. So when the people connected, the early church collected the canon, they didn't have a lot of work to do. They just had a work of collecting these old books, comparing to ama scrolls ababe now from all these families ababe now from Amalon, ama scribes and from ama synagogues, to see what was the original like. But not only that, we had abantu ababezwa ukuthi ama-Masoretes nama-Talmudists, and those people were also tasked with the task of making sure that these things are preserved. You can read more about them. I'll recommend a book at the end. You can read more about ama-Masoretes and Talmuds, but they made sure that these things are also kept intact and pure. So all the books of the Old Testament were also kept in that sense. You can say that they are very, very reliable compared to any book that you can ever find on earth, because from isikhathi sibhalwa umuntu original, sibhalwa Moses, they were translated by Joshua was they were transcribed. I'm sorry, I keep confusing these two. It's transcribed, not translated. So they were transcribing, which means they were taking and writing word for word what they were getting from our originals. So that was kept from generation to generation to generation, and the oral tradition also was there. So you could already see izinto ezikhona nezingekho. So why I'm saying this because there were other books that existed that were not part of the canon. And these books were called Kokhoni ibook yaMaccabees, kukhona nencwadi kaJesha. So these books were called the Apocrypha. These books had some things because they were written, they were not inspired. So that's the right way to use. They were not inspired. Again, uNkulunkulu inspire ama-authors ukuthi ayibhale lezo incwadi lezo. But zazikhona, available. Which means ukuthi kukhona izinto ezazikhona khona ezazi-helpful. But they were not accurate. We told ukuthi there was someone who was writing a history of the Jewish people. So eyibhalela from a perspective not inspired by uNkulunkulu. So you get incwadi njengale book of Jesha. I think ibaliwe, if you read, I think the book of Kings, ukuthi lezinto ibhaliwe kwincwadi kaJesha. So the book of Jesha was not inspired, but it was a historical book. So you could read Jesha and get historical facts, but they were not inspired. So they are called the Apocrypha because they are not inspired. Even though they might have some truth in them. Some of them had teachings that were not corresponding to what the scriptures teach. For example, abantu obsessed ngayo Enoch. Has very strange and wonderful things in it, but they are not in keeping with what we know of uNkulunkulu. They are not teaching izinto consistent with theology esiyaziyo ngoNkulunkulu. Yeah, so those books were called the Apocrypha. They were involved in some of the Bible translation before a Reformation, but when a Reformation came, those books were removed. You can still find them in Guma libraries, ama Roman Catholics, but they are not the Word of God. So we also see as the evidence, not all because the book is not quoted by Jesus Christ, it means what it's not inspired. But as part of the evidence, were not part of scripture. Jesus didn't quote from them. We don't see him quoting a book of Maccabees. We don't see him quoting from Jesha. We don't see him quoting from Enoch, so to speak. So we don't see those into happening. Not to say Jesus should have quoted zonke incwadi so that we know ukuthi iziphi incwadi ekhona. I'm just making an example ukuthi if they were inspired, as Roman Catholics would argue, we would at least see Jesus using them in his teachings or in his sermons, or quoting them at least. Right, so let's go to the question of the canon before we close. This is going to be brief. So canon, the books that we have, the 66 books, the question is, how did it come to be that we have 66 books in here? So the canon was compiled. Ibhayibheli lahlanganiswa laba canon first with a council that set around 325 AD, and they wanted to have a book that is going to be available and that is going to have all the books in it, but they had to have a strict qualification criteria ukuthi incwadi ikwazi ukuqualify ukuba khona nokungabikho. So in New Testament, already with Old Testament, there was not much work to do. Old Testament, they had the Septuagint. So they just took a Septuagint because they knew the Septuagint was already compiled and it had all the books from the Old Testament. So that was settled. They saw Genesis of Malachi. When it came to a canon of the New Testament, these were the criteria that they were using. Some of them, not all of them. The book had to have apostolic authority, which means it had to be written by the apostle himself or associate apostle. So that's why we see umuntu njengoMark oyekade associate kaPeter. We see umuntu njengoLuke oyi-associate kaPaul. We see uLuke when he writes kwincwadi yezenzo, he keeps on saying ukuthi sir when he speaks about Paul, because he was a companion yakhe. So when he writes lezi zinto lezi, he writes them under the authority kaPaul. So that was the first thing. Either ibhalwe umpostoli noma ibhalwe umuntu obehamba nompostoli. Two, it had to be consistent with ama-doctrines ayekade accepted. So ama-doctrines ayekade accepted is izinto njenge-divinity kaJesu Kristu, ukuthi uJesu uNkulunkulu uqobo, ngumuntu woqobo futhi. They had to be consistent with that. But other doctrines as well, it had to be consistent with the nature kaNkulunkulu. So you couldn't have incwadi echaza uNkulunkulu njengenye into except lokho esinakho kwi-Old Testament nalokho uJesu akukhuluma from the Gospels. So you couldn't have a book that just got in there without qualifying with the consistent doctrine. And also it had to be at least used by the early church fathers. So they would also look at some writings of the early church fathers, like abantu ababefana no Clement of Rome. So Clement of Rome, they wrote a lot of letters. They were encouraging abazalwane, quoting from the book of Romans, from Matthew, from Mark, from the book of 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians. So they could already see in the first century church, these were the books that were being used by the early church fathers and the early teachers of the church. Abantu abafana no Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp of Smyrna. All those people were early church fathers, and you could see ama writings abo, they were quoting incwadi eyithile, and khona incwadi eyithile ababengayiquote. So kunencwadi ke zagcina ziyi-exclude themselves because they were not in keeping with the doctrine. They were also not having apostolic authority, and they were not quoted by our early church fathers. A book like the Apocalypse of Peter. So a person would see that and say, "Oh, this must have been written by Pedro," but textual criticism would exclude incwadi kanjalo because you would find someone who writes under the pseudonym of Peter and assumes a position of being Peter. It's very easy to catch someone who does that. It's like mina namhlanje mangase ngiclaim ukuthi ngibhala ngithi ngithola incwadi kaMandela yabhalwa uMandela esejele. And when I present this book to people, ngiyithele ngecoffee, ngihambe ngiyoyineka eminyango ngiyenza ukuthi ibuye ngazi iphepha elidala. When someone reads that and wants to authenticate ukuthi ngempela ngabe yabhalwa uye yini uMandela lencwadi, he would take into njenge Long Walk to Freedom, because uMandela did write that, and he would compare ama construction of sentences. Like kukhona indlela umuntu akhuluma ngayo, uyakwazi ukumbona. Yabo mina manje mangase ngibeka omunye umuntu because ningizwile ngikhuluma ngicishe le camera lena noma ngathi une voice efana yami, you would catch some things ukuthi mhlambe mina ngiyathanda ukuthi mhlawumbe for example. And then the other person doesn't use umhlambe njengoba usebenzisa another word. So you can catch ukuthi akuyena lo muntu lo okuyena olona okade khuluma la before. So those books were cut out. Not only that, they were not in keeping with the doctrine. So they were teaching izinto outside the doctrine accepted of the church. They were not quoted by the early church. But also, you could see when you compare to the book of Peter, for example, 1 Peter and 2 Peter, that this was not written by Peter. So those books excluded themselves. There was also a Gospel of Peter. So they were saying, Peter, you know, Bali account. But again, you could see it's not in keeping with the doctrine. It doesn't have a style. So Sika Peter. And sometimes they would catch words that did not exist in the first century. For example, mangase ngithi kukhona incwadi yabhalwa uMandela ngo-1970, and somewhere there khona igama lithi tweet, you would know that it was not written by Mandela because wawungekho Twitter ngo-1970. So incwadi kanjalo, they were cut out. Abantu babebanja imifundo ukuthi this cannot be written by Peter because leli gama was not used ngalesa sikhathi lesiyana. So Gospel of Thomas was teaching very strange things about Jesus Christ. It was not in keeping with the doctrine, and it also disqualified itself. The Acts of Philip were also disqualified. They disqualified themselves really because they were not in keeping with the doctrine acceptable. So for example, the Gospel of Thomas was teaching ukuthi abantu besifazane are not worthy of life. And they need to be made male so that they will enter the kingdom of heaven. So so those books disqualified themselves. They were not included in the canon. So what we have here, in the 66 books in this book, is angifuna ukuthi sicabange lento in an academical manner njengoba sikhuluma. This is not a book yahlala umuntu thizeni phansi wakhetha wathi hayi ngizofaka le ncwadi ngifake le ncwadi. This was very well thought out. Lezi ncwadi ezilana were very well thought out. It was very well researched. And what we have as a final product, thank God, these people did all this work for us. We don't have to do it anymore. Sesinalo iBhayibheli liphambi kwethu. It was an academic exercise. It didn't come easy. It came after a very big work. But I want to close with this. The reason why iBhayibheli is reliable is not only based on evidence. Some people tend to say that Christians are people who lack evidence, who don't like evidence. We walk by faith, not by sight, which is a misuse of that verse. So when we say we walk by faith and not by sight, we are not saying that we don't care about the evidence. We do care about the evidence. We believe in the Bible because but we believe in the Bible because we have spent time to research and find out how it got to be what it is. So we are not some ignorant people abangafuni ukwazi ukuthi iBhayibheli lifike kanjani solikholwa nje linjengoba linjalo. But the main reason why we believe izwi kaNkulunkulu, it's because uNkulunkulu's promise ukuthi uzoligcina li-pure. And so unless we want to believe ukuthi uNkulunkulu has failed, we will say ukuthi izwi kaNkulunkulu selingcolisekile, it is not trustworthy anymore. There are many alterations that have been made. We cannot believe in it. We cannot put our trust in it. But if we believe Jesus lokakusho mayithi, the law and the prophets will not pass away, my words will not pass away, then we have to believe that uNkulunkulu really did keep that promise. Otherwise, we are found to be blasphemers of God. But I don't want to figure what topic next week. Next week, we will talk, God willing, about the authority yezwi likaNkulunkulu. Ngabe linayiphi authority, authority engakanani izwi likaNkulunkulu, singayikholwa yini izinto ezibhaliwe kulo. Sesibonile ukuthi there is ilona ireliability in that it was kept pure. It was preserved throughout the years by those means. But izinto ephakathi ke kulona singayekholwa yini? Is it reliable, or is it helpful for doctrine and life? In authority engakanani empilweni zethu? That's it for today. I want to recommend this book for anyone who is interested in reading further. It's called Christian Apologetics by Doc Powell. Ngayiboleka omunye umngani wami yabuye sidabukile engengimusho ngegama uyazazi yena ukhona futhi la. So it's very good. It's a good resource. Another one that's a good resource for this session is it's a book that was written by, why am I forgetting this guy? It's called The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. By Lee Strobel, Case for Christ. Excellent book. Excellent book. If you have money, go online and buy that book, because I don't think you will find it in my bookstores that are in South Africa. They shipped mine from the United States. It's an excellent book for expansion in the topic. For the next session, but we'll talk about it. This is a book that I will recommend. It's called Taking God at His Word by Kevin DeYoung. But we'll talk more about that next week when we do the Taking God at His Word part. But that's all for me. If there are questions, I'm gonna take them. But in abe mediator, my questions. Thanks.